Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you all for coming out for this important conversation on Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm Stephen Ruckman, Deputy Director of the SNF Agora Institute, an academic center and public forum at Johns Hopkins that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is shaking that young democracy and raising many questions about how other democracies should respond. That's why I'm so excited to be able to introduce today's group of internationally respected experts, each of whom brings unique insight to bear on this crisis. Each of our guests is going to spend just a few minutes at the top of the program sharing their impressions of the key issues at play, but our goal is to give all of you, our students in particular, the opportunity to ask questions, so the balance of our time will be given over to conversation with you. When it comes time for questions, just please come up to one of the two mics in the aisles, or if you're attending virtually, put your questions in the Q&A box and our student moderators will pose them live. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our experts today. Anne Applebaum, SNF Agora Senior Fellow, is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. Her newest book, The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, explains why some of her contemporaries have abandoned liberal democratic ideals in favor of strongman cults, nationalist movements, or one-party states. Her 2012 book, Gulag, A History, was recently named one of 7 books that explain why Russia wants Ukraine by the Wall Street Journal. Chris Beyrer, Desmond Tutu Professor of Public Health and Human Rights at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, is the director of the school's Center for Public Health and Human Rights and has extensive experience conducting international collaboration, research, and training programs in HIV and AIDS and other infectious diseases, including in Ukraine and Russia, where he conducted research for more than a decade until it was shut down by the Putin regime. Henry Farrell, SNF Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs, studies democracy, the politics of the internet, and international and comparative political economy. His latest book, The Uses and Abuses of Weaponized Interdependence, explores how countries gain undue influence over other societies through their dominance of information and financial networks. He is also editor of the Washington Post's Monkey Cage blog, which has been publishing articles daily on Ukraine and Russia. And finally, Peter Pomerantsev, SNF Agora Senior Fellow, works to overcome the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. His most recent book, This Is Not Propaganda, Adventures in the War Against Reality, explores the weaponization of information in Russia and beyond. Peter was born in Kyiv, but moved with his family to Germany and then to England after his father was arrested by the KGB. As you can see, there's a wealth of expertise up on stage behind me, and so without further ado, let me turn it over to Anne.
Thank you. So thank you very much for that introduction. And can you hear me with this mask on? Right, okay, because I can't hear myself. Let me begin by speaking a little bit about the origins of this war, why it's happening, because I think that will help us understand actually what's happened, where we have got to just now. This is a war that has been a long time in the making. It's being conducted by Vladimir Putin, who began his career as a KGB officer in East Germany, and while in that capacity, witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall thanks to the power of democratic ideas and thanks to the power of street movements. He was in Dresden, in East Germany at the time the wall fell, and has written and spoken in the past of the horror he felt when he and his comrades were burning their documents in the courtyard of their headquarters while they were afraid of demonstrators breaking in all around them. And the power of that moment, a moment that many of us saw as a great moment of liberation and freedom and happiness, was for him the end of an era and a great tragedy. He has spent most of his career plotting or thinking about how to reverse that moment and how to take it back, how to win back the position that Russia then had as a part of the Soviet Empire, and how to and how to fight against those same forces that he now sees elsewhere. For him, Ukraine has a dual significance. Number one, it was the largest part, it was the second largest republic in the Soviet Union. It's the sort of bridge between Russia and Europe. It's a former colony of Russia, in essence. It was a land colony of Russia, both in the Russian Tsarist era and then again in the Soviet period, much as the way Ireland was a kind of land colony of England. And the Russians had for a long time many of the same attitudes to Ukraine that the British once had to the English once had to the Irish. It's a kind of peasant nation that can't rule itself. In addition to that, though, Ukraine has a second significance for him, which is that it's a country that has been fighting for 3 decades really, to make itself into a modern Western-style democracy. And there have been, if you count 1991, 2004, and 2014, there have been street revolutions exactly of the kind that Putin once saw in Berlin, that have been designed to overthrow autocratic, kleptocratic dictators who were either loyal to or deeply connected to the Russian state, which is also autocratic and kleptocratic. And Putin, and Ukraine has come to represent exactly the movements and the ideas that he most resents. In the meantime, it is true that Ukraine, which, as I say, is a former colony and didn't have its own state until 1991, has genuinely, has created a kind of national identity that is very much wrapped up in the idea of becoming a democracy and becoming integrated into the West, and avoiding the deep corruption that they see in their neighbor Russia. And so, in a certain sense, what Putin sees is correct. He sees that the ideas that motivate Ukrainians and motivate the current Ukrainian government, but also many Ukrainian activists and politicians from with actually a wide range of across their political spectrum, the ideas that motivate them are directly in contradiction to the ideas that he believes in and that he is using to rule Russia. I mean, he is now very much so. Russia now is different from the Soviet Union in that it's very much a one-man show. In the olden days, in the Soviet period, there was a Politburo. There were other institutions that moderated the leadership, especially in the post-Stalin years. Putin has no checks and balances. He has no controls over what he does. He is in effect in control of the equivalent of Congress, the White House, the FBI, the CIA, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, ExxonMobil, and Apple and Google. All of those companies and those institutions answer to him in Russia. At the same time, despite this great power and despite the lack of controls, which means that he can act in a spontaneous way, he remains anxious and worried and afraid of the language of democracy and the language of Ukrainian sovereignty that he feel threaten him. That's the root of the conflict. That's also why it's so hard to understand right now how it will end. Because he's repeated it again a couple of hours ago. He keeps saying that this can only end with the destruction of Ukraine and with the elimination of Ukraine. He said several times that Ukraine is not a real country. It must be removed from maps. And it's as if he now sees the elimination of it as the last great act of his presidency of Russia. And the difficulty for diplomats in negotiating out of this, and for others who want to end the war, is that's a very extreme and radical and violent vision that is hard to moderate. And to pull back from that and to say, well, actually, we really only wanted Crimea, or we only wanted a little piece of Ukraine, now may be difficult. But that, maybe as we'll discuss, that's one of the possible ways that this can end. I want to let Peter speak a little bit more. We've just agreed that he'll talk a little bit more about the significance of Ukraine and the Ukrainians, but let me just begin that by saying one of the unexpected aspects of this war, and I've been writing about Ukraine for 2 decades. I wrote a book about Ukraine. I never imagined that the physical bravery of Ukrainians and of a Ukrainian president whose background is as a Jewish comedian would come to symbolize the defense of democracy, and would by doing so in such a extraordinary way, would shift Western public opinion and elite opinion with such incredible speed. As Yuval Noah Harari said in a conversation I did with him, organized with him yesterday, one of the extraordinary things about Zelensky and about this Ukrainian national movement is that it combines two things that we thought were separate. So it's, on the one hand, it is nationalist or patriotic, if you'd rather use that word, but it's a kind of civic nationalism. So it's a belief in the state and the nation that is, again, open to different kinds of people. You can be Jewish, you can be Russian-speaking, you can be Ukrainian-speaking, and you're still a Ukrainian as long as you're together with them and you support those ideas. And it combines that idea with liberal values of a kind that we would recognize. And so if there's been a culture war in the West over the last decade or so between people who think that nationalism and liberalism have to be, or patriotism and liberalism have to be opposed to each other, he's showing us something really different. And I think the power of that imagery and the courage of what they've done has had already a kind of galvanizing effect on shifting German politics. The Germans have wanted to stay didn't want to be in this war, they didn't want to arm Ukraine, and then the sight of the Ukrainians fighting back within a few days led to an extraordinary speech by the German chancellor saying that actually they're going to raise their defense budget and they're going to begin arming Ukraine. Similar galvanizing effect on the European Union, on countries across Europe who were skeptical or doubtful about whether Ukraine was real or whether it was worth defending only 2 weeks ago, and who now see that it's a country that has identified itself as European in the sense of believing in the values of the European Union. So the rule of law, independent judiciary, a political system free of corruption, freedom of speech, and liberal social values. And that they see that somebody is fighting for that and willing to die for that, which is not something that anybody in the rest of Europe has had to do for a very long time. And so, as I said, on the one hand, you have Putin, who sees these values as his mortal enemy, and on the other hand, you have the Ukrainians who are defending them with really great bravery. I'm happy to talk more about the details of the war and what's going on right now, but let me now let Peter speak.
Anne, thank you. So I'm going to focus on one thing only after the overview, which is sort of related to the work I do here at Hopkins, which is all about trying to understand propaganda and what we do about it. But maybe through that we can tease out later some of the sort of larger things going on. So zooming down into sort of the language that Putin is using in this conflict, I think there's two things for us to think about, and both of them are very, very important. The first one is the way he talks about Ukrainians. Back in the sort of 1930s and 40s, there was this really rather remarkable German Jewish academic called Victor Klemperer, who, even though he was Jewish, stayed throughout the whole Nazi period in the Second World War in Dresden, in Europe, in what would be Eastern Germany. And he managed to stay alive and not get taken off to Auschwitz because his wife was German. But he lost his job, he lost his home, he lost all his dignity and most of his rights. He spent most of his time sort of in and out of Gestapo jail cells getting beaten up. But through all that time, he tried to sort of also work out, why was Nazi propaganda so powerful? Was it Hitler's speeches? He was like, well, sometimes, not always. People aren't always into them. And he decided that it was something much more subtle. It was the Nazis' use of language. And essentially, the Nazis had invented a language which defined social categories and defined who was deserving of life and who was undeserving of life. And very simply, it's things like there was an Übermensch, the Supermen, the Germans, and the Untermensch, the Jews, the Gypsies, and the Untermenschen, the underpeople. They really weren't deserving of life. Yeah? First, you create these categories, and then you create a category of people who don't deserve to live, who are vermin, who are a threat. Then you have the Volks community, the Volksgemeinschaft, the community, the real people, inside of which you have, genuine sort of values and love in many ways. But anything outside of that deserves to perish and certainly has no rights. So Putin is really very, very explicitly, almost consciously, using very, very similar categories about the Ukrainians. He said there's a real people, of a real brotherly, essential people of the Belarusians, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. These brotherly people. He keeps on saying that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people. It's very weird. But everybody who doesn't agree with that in Ukraine, well, they're not real people. So we're going to have to get rid of those. And we know already there are kill lists of anybody who doesn't agree with his version of who the real people are. We know that there are plans to create, which sounds absurd, but those plans are out there to create concentration camps to put them in. The mind boggles, but that is what the intelligence is telling us. That is what its language is telling us. Then there's a very funny twist, because what he says is, all the people who don't agree with me in Ukraine are actually Nazis. Which is weird because, he's using the word Nazi the way the Nazis use the word Jew. He's saying, well, if they're all Nazis, and who's worse than a Nazi, then they all deserve to die. He keeps on saying that. I spent the night last night watching Russian TV. I had to get through quite a few beers to do it. But it literally is like these 50-something, very, very angry, clearly sexually frustrated men going, Nazis, 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 kill! There literally are no women and nobody under 44, which is my age, so we'll call that the youth age now. But it's a very strange thing. He's using the word Nazi the way the Nazis use the word Jew, but what does that do? It's very frightening, because if they're Nazis, well, you've got to kill them. But even more so, it kills the word Nazi, because that used to be a very powerful word. Calling somebody a Nazi had power in it. Calling someone a fascist had power in it. If you constantly repeat it, it's almost as if you get rid of this word, which was meant to be a taboo on the worst behavior, and make that worst behavior possible. Because we want to go, no, you're the Nazi. He goes, no, you're the Nazi. And suddenly the word Nazi and everything that came with it, its power as a check on behavior, disappears, and you have this moral wasteland where everything is possible. So that is how Vladimir Putin is talking about Ukrainians, and without getting into any really sort of deep ideas about democracy, I would fight as well if I was them. I mean, I think for a lot of people it's also like survival. They see what monster is coming for them, and they see his intent, and they know what Moscow has always done in Ukraine, which is genocide. Actually, Anne has written a book about how the term genocide was partly invented as a way to make sense of what Stalin did to the Ukrainians. So they have a long history of knowing what will happen to them. So they're fighting for many reasons, for values, but also because they know what's coming. They can hear the way he's talking about them. But there's another bit to Putin's propaganda and rhetoric, which is not about Ukraine. It's about you guys, well, most of you, because it's a very multinational audience, but the Americans among you. He's constantly talking about you, all the time. And it's everywhere in Russia. It didn't start in 2004 with NATO expansion. It's been there always. I was going to Russia in the 90s, in the early 2000s, go back in history. They're obsessed with America. America is the ideal and the thing they hate. America is the thing they want respect from and can never gain it, and therefore they loathe. It's a very invented idea of America. It's nothing to do with the reality of this confusing country. It's like the thing that you need to define yourself against. But also, it's very much to do with this moment of 1989. Putin's great defeat in life was the victory of democracy, which was in some ways led by America. And now, non-stop, in Putin's mouth and on Russian propaganda, they're always repeating, America is in charge of Europe. Actually, it's not the Ukrainians who are deciding their fate, they're just puppets of America. France, puppets of America. Germany, puppets of America. Britain might as well be America. You laugh, because he's obviously lying. So he's lying about you every day. It's like having a crazy stalker who is going around the internet putting lies about you all the time, and then talking about nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying he's about to bomb Kentucky. But he's obsessed with you. He's thinking about you. What he's starting in Ukraine will grow and grow and grow. And I don't know which form it'll take. Political warfare, ways of humiliating you, ways of showing that NATO, which is he thinks is your great sort of like, your great power projection project that most Americans, I think, want to get out of, but doesn't matter. He'll try to show that it's a busted flush. NATO is the America's guarantee to defend Eastern Europe, So he's not stopping at Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is his murderous obsession right now, but his real target is an idea of you guys. And again, we have to think about what that means, how that attack will come, but it will come in some way. And his job is to make you feel as empty and as worthless and as pointless as he felt in that moment in 1989. How he'll do that? Maybe you know, I don't know.
Well, I feel like I've just learned so much about this from both of you, and I really deeply appreciate it. I'm going to talk about something quite different. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist, and I've worked for a number of years in the region, in Russia, also in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan, and in Ukraine. And what I want to focus on is really two aspects of this conflict that are emerging right now. One is what has to be seen as a particular aspect of the way that Putin and the Russians go to war, which is the attacks on healthcare facilities, healthcare workers, and patients, which has been a major aspect, for example, of their approach in Syria, where they've been backing the Assad regime and have committed an incredible number of war crimes. The second is, of course, that this is all unfolding, unfortunately, in the middle of this pandemic of COVID-19, and this is a very vulnerable region for that. And the worst possible thing you could do in this kind of pandemic is have enormous flows of people crowding in spaces where nobody can socially distance, and people moving into places that have low vaccine coverage and have used low efficacy vaccines. So there's a humanitarian crisis and there's a public health crisis underway. I just was looking at the numbers, and it's almost impossible to stay current, but we're now just past 1 million people having fled since February 24th, most of them women and children. So that's already the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. But just before I talk about those two other issues, I just want to share with you a little bit about where the Russian views and public health approaches are coming from, because I think it really helps inform what is happening there, and to contrast that a little bit with Ukraine, which had been going in a very different direction, and very much in the direction of what we would call evidence-based, rational, public health-oriented, scientifically based approaches to health and social problems, as opposed to where the Russians have been and where Putin has so vigorously enforced his own views. So I started working there in 2003 in Moscow, in fact, because a graduate student of mine had worked for years in Russia, was fluent in Russian, had started a Russian aid service organization, and really wanted to do her PhD in that context, and basically invited me, and I'd never been there and never worked there. And I got to know through her a number of Russian civil society, public health groups, the LGBT community, the sex worker union, and we started doing collaborative HIV work together. And it was just enormously difficult. This was 2003, 2004, but it was possible. And we were able to get funding from the US government. We were able to work with Moscow State University. We were able to work with academics. We actually got approval from the Russian authorities to go forward with this work. It was not easy, but it was doable. We had support from the Gates Foundation, from WHO. The CDC was there at the time, the US Centers for Disease Control. They were supportive and engaged. We got training money from the Fogarty International Center of the NIH. And it grew and it built, and we eventually established the largest and only truly anonymous and voluntary HIV testing and counseling center for gay and bisexual men, for the gay community in Moscow, and had 1,500 clients and a really vibrant project underway. But at that time, this was kind of 2010, 11, 12, Putin was starting to push this anti-gay, anti-homosexuality agenda, and also to contrast what was happening in Europe with marriage equality and with growing rights space, and essentially putting Russia in this position of standing up against this degenerate West. Then, with the help of US evangelicals, it must be said, they passed in a number of provincial Dumas, and then eventually in the Russian Duma, this anti-homosexuality propaganda law, which forced us, for example, to take down an educational website. You couldn't have an educational website, although they kept the hookup apps going. And then the Russian skinheads and thugs used those to entrap gay men and beat them, sometimes kill them. And then eventually that led to attacks on our clinic, attacks on our clients, attacks on our staff, and we had to close the project down. We kept collaborating, but shortly thereafter, the next phase of this was a law, and this relates very much to what Peter was saying, that said essentially that any Russian entity that received US federal money had to declare itself a foreign entity, foreign agent. And that essentially meant that none of our partners could continue to collaborate with us, and we basically had to fold. On the other hand, we were doing work in Ukraine in drug policy reform with the prisons on HIV, viral hepatitis, tuberculosis. And it was, and is, as long as the Ukrainians are still in charge of it, really a beacon in the region for progressive policy reform. And very much this embrace of what Anne is saying of the West, of being and it's not a Western notion, it's essentially the global scientific consensus, except Russia, about how to do this. Now, let me give you just one concrete example of how rigorously and aggressively they enforced these ideas. So with the occupation of Crimea in 2014, Crimea, of course, was a part of Ukraine. They had a very bad injection drug use epidemic. There's tons of heroin. It is one of the most heavily affected regions in the world because of that problem, as is Russia. And the Ukrainians were doing methadone. Methadone is illegal in Russia. The first day of the occupation of Crimea, they stopped methadone, right? Like before you would take over the radio station, you just occupied some part of somebody's country, and that is your highest priority. Stop methadone. So of course, people who are on methadone are opioid dependent. They very often go back to using. There were overdoses, there were suicides. And the Open Society Foundation organized a flotilla of buses to get people, drug users, out of Crimea and into parts of Ukraine where they could get treatment, right? So I assure you that if the Russians prevail in Ukraine, they will stop methadone, they will stop all of these progressive policies, and they will also vigorously implement this anti-LGBTQ agenda as quickly as they possibly can, because that is part of the project. That's how it works. So what to say about these attacks on healthcare workers? There have been at least now 24 documented attacks on hospitals, including a maternity hospital, a blood donation center where a number of blood donors were killed, an oncology center that was clearly marked as a cancer treatment facility. Most of these have not been confirmed. Only one we can actually confirm, which is in Kharkiv. I'm a member of the Committee on Human Rights for the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering. So we are working on documenting this, as are a number of other groups. Happily, I can say the International Criminal Court has already opened up a case of investigation. These are war crimes, right? Attacking a hospital is a war crime. It is an atrocity, and Putin needs to be held accountable for it. He is a war criminal, right? That's not how he perceives himself, but that is going to have to be part of how this is pursued, and that includes accountability for war crimes, which is such a fundamental aspect of what we hope eventually will be restorative justice for this country. That really matters. Just on the COVID, and that's the last thing I'll talk about, Ukraine and the region has had a real problem with low vaccine uptake and coverage. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in many of these countries. If your only choice was either Russian or Chinese vaccines, you also would have vaccine hesitancy. We're not immune from this in the United States, as you all know. But nevertheless, there's a huge concern. Think about thousands of people in crowded subway stations with no ventilation, right? Think about 1 million people in less than 10 days, women and children crowding together and moving into other countries like Poland and Moldova that also have low vaccine coverage and have had ongoing COVID surges. This is a real, already a public health and humanitarian crisis, but it is one that is going to be exacerbated by what is happening with COVID. And of course, it need hardly be said that there are all kinds of other interruptions in healthcare already underway. Maternity hospitals are moving into their basements to try and have women deliver. It really is, it's just an extraordinary situation. But I just want to close by saying that these attacks on healthcare and healthcare facilities are a fundamental feature of really what is an attempt to terrorize civilian populations. These are terror tactics, right? And that Putin has done it in Syria, and he is now aggressively doing it in Ukraine. And that we have to hold him accountable to that. I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'm a little bit different again, in that I don't have any expertise on Russia or Ukraine as such. The kinds of things that I study have much more to do with the response that we've seen to Russia and Ukraine, and in particular, the ways in which various economic networks have been used to try and isolate Russia from the world economy. And here, really what we've seen is we've seen a lot of discussion of sanctions and of SWIFT and of this, that, and the other. Of if you want to dig into the technical details, you have different kinds of things such as designations, freezing of assets, and so on. What all of this really tries to do, when translated into more ordinary language, is it tries to identify choke points in the world economy, and then to utilize them in order to cut Russia out of the systems that are necessary if Russia is to have any engagement with global trade, with global finance, with all of these aspects of the global economy which we all depend upon to an incredible extent. And this has really happened in a pretty extraordinary way. We have seen these tools being used before, for example, against Iran. So that there has been a lot of discussion of the so-called SWIFT financial messaging system, which is an important part of the way in which money gets sent around the world. And this tool was used in order to isolate Iran in the lead up to the JCPOA, the agreement under which Iran, for a period, said that it would stop trying to develop nuclear weapons. This was, in effect, because Iran have been targeted using SWIFT and also using the so-called dollar clearing system, which is a system which is under US control, which is effectively central to the way in which global banks work. Very simply speaking, if you want to be a global bank, you need to have access to dollars, because dollars are what international trade is very often denominated in. And that means that if you are able to exclude banks from having access to dollars through the dollar clearing system, you are then able to cut these banks out of the global system. And you're also able to turn foreign banks, which don't have any direct connection with the United States, you're able to turn them into policemen on your behalf, because they are terrified of what will happen to them if they do not have access to dollar clearing. And this means that even in areas where the United States did not have any direct contact, it was able to get Iran cut out by European banks and by others who were worried that they were going to be either denied access or fined hundreds of millions or billions of dollars by US regulators for failing to comply with somewhat muddy and unclear US mandates as to what were the kinds of things that they could or could not do. Now, what is really interesting in the case of Ukraine and what has happened to Russia is that all of this stuff which has happened before is happening on a much bigger scale and is happening much more quickly. So these sanctions which have been introduced against Iran, these various measures which look to identify choke points, a lot of them were used before but used more slowly, so that there was a gradual drip of pressure in Russia in the last few days, we've seen these being used far more rapidly and in a way in which they, in many ways, build upon each other. So that, for example, one of the big things that has been done is to freeze Russia's central bank assets. And this is a kind of a multiplier effect, because if you cut Russian banks out of SWIFT, if you cut them out of the dollar clearing system, this has all sorts of negative consequences for Russia's currency, for the ruble, because effectively you are suddenly finding yourself in a world where you are not able to transfer your assets out of rubles into dollars or into other currencies in the world, and this suddenly means that that these assets are much less sort of valuable than they used to be, and you probably don't want to buy rubles. You want to sell rubles, and you want to sell rubles at whatever price you can get. This then means that the central bank may want to step in to try and protect Russian companies and Russian assets. It finds it far, far harder to do so if its assets have been frozen by other central banks around the world. So these are accumulating with each other, and they're also revealing new choke points in the world economy, which I think nobody expected, or at least if these were part of the plan, they certainly were not briefed in advance. So that one important place is aircraft. If you are looking at commercial aircraft, they rely on two things. First of all, Russian plane operators, like operators around the world, by and large do not own the aircraft that they use. Instead, they lease them from a small group of companies which are located in my home country of Ireland. And then when sanctions begin to apply, these companies which hold these leases have to rapidly terminate their relationships with their Russian customers. And furthermore, the aircraft that might be owned have to be maintained. And it is impossible to maintain these aircraft if you do not have Boeing and Airbus people helping you who actually have the manuals, who tell you what you need to do. And the result is that the Russian commercial fleet is likely to be effectively grounded in a matter of weeks. So all of these unexpected new choke points are being revealed as a kind of an unanticipated consequence of the this lightning attack, this lightning speed attack on the Russian economy. So we are going to see over the next few weeks, we're going to see something that I think we have not seen in history. We've never seen sanctions being applied so broadly across a wide variety of different areas of the economy. There are some important loopholes. Germany in particular and other European countries have pressed to have some kind of a carve-out for payments related to energy, because they, of course, depend upon Russian gas. But the extent to which these loopholes are going to be practicable really depends, because financial sector companies are very wary of getting in over their heads. They're worried that if they do stuff that is questionable or on the border, or might be interpreted a couple of years later by politicians or by regulators who have different values as being over the line, that they are going to get into enormous trouble. And so, as a result, we have seen, for example, extreme reluctance to actually purchase Russian oil, even though this is not something which is on its face sanctioned right at the moment. So this is a pretty extraordinary set of consequences we are only beginning to see unroll. And I have to say that I think this is true for me, this is true for most other people who studied this, none of us expected any of this to happen. Most of us expected at the end of last week we were going to see a somewhat ineffectual set of sanctions which were going to effectively, they were going to continue, but they were not going to have any broad or dramatic consequences. Now, of course, the big question is, will these sanctions work? And I think the question begs a kind of a prior question, which is, what do you mean by work? And so there are various different ways in which you might think of these sanctions having consequences. One is the standard way in which American policymakers think a lot of the time, which is in terms of trying to get these sanctions to change the behavior of a given actor. And international relations scholars such as myself talk about things like deterrence or compellence, which are fancy ways of saying that you use sanctions or you use other means to try and stop somebody from doing something which you don't want them to do, which is deterrence, or you want them to, you try to prevent them in advance from doing something that you don't want them to do, or else compellence, you try to get them to do something that they don't want to do, which in this case might be getting Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. So it is very, very difficult to use sanctions for deterrence and compellence, when you have a country which sees something as being a vital national interest. And this is not even to begin to get into the forms of craziness which both Anne and Peter have discussed with regard to Putin and the particular personalist form of dictatorship which you have. It's very, very hard to get them to do that. So I think that we cannot see very much cause for believing that this is going to get a major change of policy by the existing Russian regime. However, there may be secondary consequences. Anne has already talked about the massive sea change in German attitudes to Russia and in European Union attitudes to Russia. And one of the likely consequences of this over the next couple of years is going to be a far bigger effort to try to make Germany and Europe much less dependent upon Russia, and in particular on Russian energy resources than it has been in the past. There have been a variety of bargains which have involved very often prominent German politicians and other European politicians. Those bargains have unraveled, and while there isn't a huge amount that can be done in the short term, there's quite a lot that can be done in the medium. Final thing that we see is that there is some clear discussion among European politicians of the possibility of using these measures not to try and get Russia to change its ways, but to permanently weaken Russia as a potentially dangerous competitor which borders upon European Union states. And so here, for example, we see the French foreign minister made a statement which he quickly withdrew, but which nonetheless I think is out there, saying that this was an economic war in which the objective was the destruction of the Russian economy. We also saw the president of the European Commission somewhat more moderately saying that the idea here was to permanently weaken Russia. So even if we do not see a direct and immediate withdrawal, which I think is pretty unlikely, barring some massive change in Russian politics, I think we are seeing a longer-term confrontation between Europe and the United States on one side and Russia on the other, which is really going to sort of separate the two and which is going to have, sort of, as I say, these long-term consequences, likely including the long-term weakening of the Russian economy. Thank you.
We're now going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So if you are tuning in virtually, you pose your questions in the chat. And if you're here, please go to one of the mics. You're welcome to question this time.
Okay, hi. My question is, there's been some reports about low morale and possibly defections in the Russian military, as well as at higher levels among oligarchs, some doubt about the trajectory of the war and of the invasion. Do you think that these could have significant effects on Putin's decision-making domestically, or do you think the other factors that contribute to his thinking are far more important in continuing to pursue the invasion?
That's really the question of the hour. I'm happy to answer it, but
Sure.
to start. But there have been not just low morale. There have been desertions. There have been, soldiers running away from their equipment. That's on the ground in Ukraine. In Moscow, there have been some street protests, which, given the amount of repression right now, is amazing. There have also been some very prominent, not just celebrities. Actually, today I saw Lukoil, which is a large Russian company, protesting against the war. And there have been a handful of oligarchs who've broken and protested the war. The group of people who I think, though, that one should look to and who are the most interesting are the people who are in the security services. The way Russia works now is, as I said, it's sort of like a spider web with Putin at the top. Whereas in the old, as I said, in the old Soviet era, there was a Politburo, and we knew that if the leader fell or died or something happened to him, we knew who would be in charge of choosing the next leader. One of the strange things about modern Russia is not only do we not know who the next leader will be, we do not know how that person will be chosen. They are so far away from the rule of law that there is no succession process. And this is, of course, a source of immense instability in any country. when you don't know the way by which the next government is selected. And we don't know that much about, I mean, who it is who would, who would remove Putin or replace him or moderate him or have influence on him. We're not, we have some ideas, but not. In my view, the place to look is at the FSB and at the military. Somebody in the military was responsible for some of the failures of this invasion. So for those who don't know, this invasion was supposed to take 24 hours or 48 hours. The kind of victory articles had already been written in the newspaper, and some were accidentally published. It was supposed to be over quickly. There seems to have been no plan for a long-term war. That's why many of the troops don't have food and they don't have fuel for their vehicles. There was no sense that there would be any Ukrainian resistance at all, and it looks like people either believed Putin's propaganda or he believed his own propaganda. They believed there was no such thing as Ukraine and they wouldn't fight. So they've been very surprised. Somebody will be responsible for that. Somebody will know that terrible mistakes were made, and it may be looking towards that person to look at them for change. There also, I was talking to Peter on the way, and there's some rumors about the FSB. The Ukrainians have leaked some information saying that the FSB, which is the Russian security services, have been, somebody there is helping them or collaborating with them, which would indicate another break in the system. Whether that's true, I can't tell you. What do you think?
So it's very important when we think about social change. Look, progressive people who already didn't buy into Putin's worldview, young people, so the young people really don't buy into Putin's worldview. We know that from lots of polling. They're all against the war, but they're all completely powerless. And I'm not saying that street protests don't matter, they do. But at the end of the day, Anne's quite right. You have to think about the pillars that support the regime, that it relies on, and without whom it can't function. And you need somebody or enough movement in those places for something to change. And there's so much so much secrecy and silence around these organizations that's very hard for us to understand, basically.
Dick, another question?
Yeah, it was mentioned that Putin's Russia often enacts very reactionary social policies as well as pushing very reactionary social messages. For those who are on the more progressive side, or even just the more tolerant side when it comes to these social issues and stances, what should they do? What should they do, as well as countries that are more socially tolerant, do to help promote more socially liberal values to kind of fight back against Putin's propaganda? Because I ask, since I come from a country, South Korea, that is a liberal democracy, but some trends lately in the coming up presidential election suggest some very illiberal social values, particularly relating to gender roles. And I'm concerned that, say, if this were to happen again, Russia or maybe even China might try to interfere with the elections by promoting these values. So what should people on the more tolerant end of the spectrum do to to push forward these more socially progressive values to fight back against the propaganda and policies of people like Putin, especially considering that some of those more reactionary stances are gaining traction here in the United States. Was that clear?
Yes.
Okay.
This is very much Peter's area. I mean, my answer would be form coalitions. Think of yourself as part of a chain of people and look for other people in the chain. But others may have a view.
Well, I'll say one or two things. First of all, there's no question that the space for liberal, social, progressive values has narrowed dramatically. Putin has gone after that. That has been a target quite aggressively. So I'll just give you an example that, homosexuality was illegal in the Soviet Union. It was decriminalized by Yeltsin sort of right at the beginning. There was, in the early 2000s, a vibrant LGBT scene in Russia with all kinds of organizations, and that was part of the work that we were doing. That has dramatically closed down. So when we actually, my last time shutting down our program there, one of the people who led the project for us was actually Ukrainian, living in Moscow, a gay man, and we were alone at one point. I said, so, his name was Petra, how do you feel about this? And his response was, how I feel? I feel the way that I used to feel, as a free person walking down the street, like I have lost my freedom. I don't have that anymore. And that was 7 years ago. So I think coalitions matter, as Anne said. I think the other thing we've seen is that there has been vibrant street protests over a number of issues. There clearly is a youth movement that is going in different directions, but it's just an incredibly narrow space right now. I think it matters.
Take another question. Sure.
My question, unfortunately, takes a bit more of a pessimistic view. From the looks of it, it doesn't seem like the Ukrainian military is going to be able to hold on for more than another couple weeks or months without enormous amounts of outside support. Cities are starting to fall. Do you see a situation in which financial sanctions and diplomacy works, or is it likely that NATO troops are going to be in conflict with Russians within the next year or two over Ukraine or over Putin's next land grab?
It's funny, as I'm checking my messages, because a lot of my friends are in Ukraine, and a lot of my, or just left, or relatives there, and my family's there. But a lot of them is these sort of ups and downs of optimism, pessimism, and the way I'm getting through it is, fine, he takes it over, and then what? Then the insurgency starts. So this might be a very long war. It might not. There might be some sort of twist coming soon, weirdly because of the sanctions, which we don't quite understand what the secondary effects are going to be. But let's say that this military logic goes on. I mean, I'm not a military person. There's people here who understand it better than me, but it doesn't end there. So it could go on and on and on. But so I don't think there's going to be any, for better or worse, depends where you sit, any kind of NATO troop or air force intervention. So I don't think that panic that some people are having is like, oh my God, we're on the edge of nuclear war with Russia. It's like, we're not. We're on the edge of standing aside as people get genocided. But he wants more. He does want to test NATO. If his aim is to humiliate America, the way you do that is by showing that NATO is an empty vessel. And the way you do that is by testing NATO, and there's all sorts of clever ways you can do that, which would be kind of an intervention in NATO territory, maybe around the Baltics, which isn't really, or kind of is, or it's ambiguous. So he will push that and push that and push that, because that's what gives his life meaning, and what gives his propaganda narratives meaning. So it will. So I think that's what I was trying to say. It's not just about Ukraine. He's going to take as much as he can and push as much as he can. I don't think he's a suicide bomber. I think he's something worse. He's somebody drunk on his own power who has lost his ability to calculate because he's lost his touch with reality, because he's an old man living in a bubble. So he is like the crazy uncle who thinks that COVID isn't real at the Thanksgiving party, but he's got nukes.
So I have a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, said the other day, look at him sitting at the end of those long tables, afraid to get close to his generals or to foreign leaders. Does that look like someone who wants to die in a nuclear war? No. So that's so he may not be interested in mutually assured destruction. But so that would be.
So that's a comfort, isn't it?
That's a comfort.
Great. Yeah. And you were being pessimistic. He might set off a tactical nuke though to destroy half a city in Ukraine and prove a point.
Or set off one in the air, which is what they've exercised in the past. Just blow one up over the Baltic Sea. Just to see what people do. That's what they exercise. So there are these regular military exercises where they exercise the taking of the nuclear weapons out of wherever they are and putting them onto planes. And
what happens then? Sorry, you explode it in the air.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's to scare everybody, and then after that, everybody gives up and says, "We give up."
But is there like acid nuclear rain that comes down? Is it like a Chernobyl?
I'm not sure. A physicist in this room would have to explain.
Are there any scientists at Johns Hopkins? I don't know.
Our university risk officer, Jonathan Links, is a nuclear fallout expert. You
There
should
you
ask
go.
John Links.
Can we text him?
Yeah. But this is not my area, but I do know from a friend and colleague that one of the innovations, if you will, is that they have much smaller tactical nukes,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
That-
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they're not,
that's right,
this
yeah.
is not Hiroshima.
No,
These are
they're
much
just
smaller, but they're still nuclear, yeah.
Small, so small. Yes. Anyway, another
Tiny.
question.
Thank you. So during this talk, I've been listening to a lot about the democratic ideology and how that's clashing with Putin's main objective. But I wonder if there's any major economic reasons of why this conflict is happening, and then how Russia's withdrawal from the global economy will have a permanent effect on the global economy, since it's still a major exporter of oil and natural resources. And then we do see a pretty big fluctuation in natural resource prices, and then maybe inflation that's going to soon happen in the US and outside of the US. So what kind of effect does that have on the civilians in Russia or outside of Russia permanently?
We don't know. It's and this is I think what Peter said. Sort of is the one question is, do sanctions get weird in Russia? That is, what kinds of consequences might they have in a situation where this is a war which Putin did nothing to prepare people for? So this is part of the problem with the military, is that even the military lower down didn't know what was going to happen until effectively it happened. People had not been prepped for this war, so this kind of came out of left field for a lot of citizens in Russia. And so when they suddenly find themselves at war, when they find themselves in a situation where a lot of the stuff that they're used to just isn't available anymore, perhaps they all hunker down. That certainly has happened and could happen and has happened in Iran. Perhaps they get really angry, and perhaps this combines with some sort of mothers of Russian soldiers protesting, and stuff begins to happen. Although again, to just reinforce, as both Anne and Peter have said, autocratic regimes, by and large, they fall not when there are massive popular protests, but when there is when there is a split within the elite, sometimes being reinforced by the protests. In terms of global consequences, we've already seen a spike in oil prices, obviously, and this is going to have all sorts of weird and interesting consequences for global warming, climate change, and so on. So I think one way you might think about it is as follows: that if you're living in a place like the United States where fracking is possible, so if I think of the operators of fracking oil companies are just rubbing their hands in happiness because suddenly they are back into the realm where they can start to make pretty big profits again by opening up the gusher. If you are looking at this from the point of view of Germany, you're going to have a very different set of calculations, and perhaps you're going to start you're going to start thinking, as the Greens have already begun to think about, trying to somehow keep the nuclear installations that you had said you're going to close down, keeping them alive if you at all possibly can. It's not clear that you can. And then also moving to renewables, not just because green is nice, but also because renewables are by and large things you can do within your own national borders, so you don't have to worry about some external actor turning the tap off. And if you are in a world where oil and gas are far more expensive than they used to be, that gives you additional economic motivations to start to try and figure out other stuff. There may be other repercussions. So Adam Tooze had a newsletter a couple of days ago where he suggested that a lot of the money that Russia has been making from these trades, it's what people call petrodollars. And petrodollars, they don't sit still. They're used in a variety of different financial transactions back and forth. And so you could find yourself in a world with unexpected counterparty risks, chains of collapse and whatever. None of those are very likely to happen. But I think the fundamental point is that you're taking, and I think this is where your question points to, you're taking huge decisions against a medium to important sized part of the global economy. We do not know how huge parts of the global economy actually hang together. And so if you're pulling 2 or 3, yeah, this is true. And I've got a whole rant I could give you about this. One of the problems is, if you're an economist, you've got nice models, but those models only very roughly correspond to the actual control of their supply chains through which stuff happens. And so you're pulling 2 or 3 cards out from the house, and you're hoping to God that the entire damn thing doesn't collapse on you. And probably you're right, but probably.
Was that the discussion they have, like in the central banks? Like, we don't know what's going to happen.
Hi everyone, thank you. We're at time, and I apologize to the people. We had a lot of people online with questions, but this time just went fast. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to thank Chris and Peter and Anne and Henry for spending this hour with us. I know everybody has been watching all of these events, and it's been really helpful and fascinating to have these perspectives. All right, now. Well, thank you. Thank you to our panelists for spending this hour with us. Thank you for everyone who came in person and who viewed online. This is the end of our program. Thank you so much for being here.